Good evening, everyone. Welcome to McGill and the Trottier Public Science Symposium. It's my pleasure to introduce Dean Bruce Lennox for a little welcoming speech. He's the Dean of Science.
Good evening, everyone. It's great to welcome you to McGill University for one of the most important events in the McGill calendar each year. Including convocation addresses, I think this is certainly in the top of most people's lists of an event that brings the public to McGill and brings McGill to the public in a really, really important way. To mark the event tonight, we have two fantastic speakers who will be introduced in a moment. But what I wanted to give you is a very brief overview of why we're here and how is it that we are together talking about these really important subjects. The Trottier Public Science Symposium is actually a structure within the very important Office for Science and Society that was funded from an incredible gift from the Trottier Family Foundation. The symposium is always bringing people together to think about how do we approach problems using that phrase with critical thinking. How do we look at topics that are out in the public space and require some retelling, some removing a mythology or the mysticism sometimes. Joe often refers to this as debunking, and I think you've introduced perhaps a new word, debaffling. You can trademark that, Joe. But what this symposium shows us year after year is that communication of science requires an agility of thought and expression that goes far beyond what we experience in everyday life. And yet at the same time, it's about everyday life. So for 25 years, the OSS has been dealing with this incredible topic of disinformation and misinformation. It was an issue, a problem 25 years ago, and now it's almost taken over everything that we're doing. So how does this happen? Well, Lauren Trottier is the person who made this happen. The Family Foundation, the Trottier Family Foundation is the organization behind the symposium. And the organization itself is really an intersection of Lauren's remarkable vision and generosity. And Joe Schwartz and his team for the last 25 years has brought these topics and these ideas and Mr. Trottier's vision, the McGill vision into something that's really very coherent. So thank you, Lauren, and thank you, Louise. It's great to see you this evening. So, this year the symposium brings two renowned speakers to give us their insights into something that we encounter every breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Are we what we eat? Or does it seem so? We're going to find out. I think that what this is also saying is that how the message is so important in tonight's symposium is that we are all living science, we all experience science, and we all have to have an appreciation of how it's communicated. So over to you, Joe, and it's great to see you this evening.
Thank you, Bruce. Just to show you how important this event has become, we've trotted out the heavy artillery because we have McGill's president, Professor Deep Saini, also to say a few words.
Thank you, Dr. Schwartz. Good evening, everybody. Bonsoir à toutes et tous, et bienvenue. Welcome to the Trottier Public Science Symposium, which is hosted by the McGill's Office for Science and Society. Since its inauguration in 2005, this symposium has become a popular fall tradition here at McGill, and it is made possible thanks to the Trottier Family Foundation. So let me first begin by saying thank you to Lauren and Louise, who are sitting in front of me, for their generous gift. Thank you for your generous gift and for making this incredible opportunity possible for us to share scientific knowledge and ideas with public. In a time of social and political division across the world, forums such as this are more important than ever because they reaffirm the critical role of a university in our society. And this role is in terms of the university's responsibility and ability to create knowledge, to educate, and to debunk by providing evidence. It is truly special to see such a large number of people present here tonight. Through your presence, you are demonstrating that you are engaged with this exercise of using evidence to learn and to educate. Thank you. I want to thank again the Trottier Family Foundation and to everyone present here tonight for recognizing the value of research-based knowledge and for your commitment to learning. L'objectif de ce soir est de promouvoir le sens critique et la communication scientifique et de présenter des informations scientifiques à un public plus large. Over the years, the Trottier Public Science Symposium has covered a range of timely subjects, such as vaccines, life in the outer space, and quest for human longevity. This year's speakers will help us demystify the properties and benefits of Ozempic and dietary supplements, two of the subjects that generate a lot of interest, a lot of discussion, and of course, a lot of misinformation, disinformation, and hype. So we will hear all about it today. So it is my pleasure to thank this evening's speakers, Dr. Patricia Brubaker and Dr. Pieter Cohen, for being with us today and for helping us separate sense from nonsense. We are all eagerly anticipating your presentations, myself included. Now, speaking of separating sense from nonsense, it is my pleasure now to introduce someone who is a master at doing that, and that is our own Dr. Joe Schwartz. Come, I'm going to say a few more words to embarrass you, but stand here with me. Joe will introduce our speakers in more detail, but before I let him do that, I want to say a few words about him. As you know, he is a popular McGill academic and a public figure in Montreal and beyond. He's the director of McGill's Office of Science and Society. He is involved, he's loved by many people in this city for his informative and entertaining public lectures and his teaching on topics ranging from the chemistry of food to the connection between body and the mind. And what I always find amazing about Joe is his ability to take incredibly complex information and ideas and then distill them down to something so simple that even people like me can understand them. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Professor Joe Schwartz. Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm not sure loved by everyone. There are a few people out there. Okay. Well, our task here in our office is, as you heard, to separate sense from nonsense. We take issue with the snake oil salesmen out there, and we try to replace them with science. It isn't always easy. We hope to foster critical thinking. It's always a pleasure to introduce this event, but it's also challenging to say a few words that connect what you're going to hear. So I was thinking, how do I connect Ozempic, for weight loss and dietary supplements? Let me give it a shot. Let's ask the question, how do natural supplement makers play the game? You find some issue that the public knows about and that they want help with. And then you go online and you start searching. You put in your few keywords. Natural is obviously one. If you can call something natural, it will sell. So you hunt through the scientific literature, in this case, weight loss and GLP-1, and you come up with some papers that have some sort of natural product connection. And then you, of course, play the Mother Nature knows best card, and that anything that is natural is safe, and anything that is synthetic is questionable. And you very conveniently forget about the viruses and the parasites and the bacteria that demonize our lives. And you also forget about the synthetic drugs that make life bearable for a lot of people. So you hunt down this paper, and whether it's reasonable or not, if it has the right keywords, then you run with it. And if you can say that it's being clinically studied, so much the better. You don't have to say that it was clinically studied and it failed. All you have to do is say that it has been clinically studied. And then if there's a smidgen of fact, then you go ahead and build a mountain out of that grain. And this has been done with semaglutide. Now, of course, semaglutide is a very legitimate substance. It's the active ingredient in Ozempic. And we all know the success that it has had in weight loss. But here's the trouble that the natural product salespeople face. Ozempic, first of all, is a prescription drug, and it is very expensive. So what do? You ask Kourtney Kardashian. Because she has a company. The name of the company is Lemme, L-E-M-M-E. Let me know, I guess. Let me live my life is what it means. So she has come out with GLP-1, and there it is on the label. What does that suggest? That is what is in the product, which, as you will hear, is a scientific impossibility. You cannot have that in here. It's a complex entity. It's a peptide linked to fatty acids. I mean, they cannot. So there's no GLP-1 in there. So what do? You go back to those papers that you rounded up from the scientific literature, which have some natural connection, and you look to see, is there anything that has been studied for weight loss, anything that has a GLP-1 connection? So you round up these 3 papers, and you make a big deal out of them, even though there's nothing to do with the product that you are selling. As you can see in this particular paper, they found some slight elevation in GLP-1. They didn't even look at weight control. The other one that they're pushing looked at diabetes markers, makes no mention of GLP-1. And the third one, no mention of GLP-1 at all. It did show some slight weight loss. The important thing to realize is this product has never been clinically tested because there's no requirement for clinical testing before you put it on the market. But you can put a label that is very catchy. There it is, GLP-1. Everyone has heard about it. Think that it's an Ozempic analog. You also see their cravings and weight management. That has not been proven for this product. Those are taken out of thin air. And patented bioflavonoids. Well, first of all, Ozempic has nothing to do with bioflavonoids. And patented means nothing either. It doesn't mean that you have shown it to be effective. So this is a misleading product. But if your goal is to enrich the coffers of Kourtney, then by all means go ahead and buy it. But if your goal is to find something that really works, then you better search elsewhere, which is just what we're going to do. So let me introduce our first speaker, Dr. Patricia Brubaker. I tell you, I've had a lot of exciting moments in my life, and a lot of them have been connected to McGill. I've had real pleasurable moments. I think maybe the top one was when I was in the platform committee, and I confirmed MD degrees on my two daughters at the same time, one after the other. How did that happen? Because one of them had a baby in between and finished at the same time. And that, I never thought that, that would be surpassed. That was just such a great moment. But another great moment is when you get to introduce someone who you've known for a long time and who you may have had something to do with in terms of getting them to where they are. I first met Pat 1973. And she was in my class. She looked a little bit different then. Maybe the hair was a little bit redder. And here she is in my organic class with her future-to-be husband. And that was many, many years ago. She went on to have a stellar career at University of Toronto and as a biochemist, as a physiologist. She played a big role in the development of GLP-1, written numerous papers, graduated many, many students. And it really makes me proud that, I think that I may have had just a little something to get her into science that 52 years ago. Pretty unbelievable. All right, so we're going to call on Pat to enlighten us on Ozempic. There's a clock.
Wave if there's a clock.
Yeah, oh, okay.
Okay.
I'll wave.
Yep, great. Okay, so thank you so much, Joe, for that lovely introduction. Everything he said about our interactions is absolutely true. Joe was one of my first mentors, real mentors in science, and so I'm incredibly grateful to him for the invitation to speak today, and as well as to the Trottiers for sponsoring this symposium. It's a wonderful, wonderful initiative on your part, so thank you for that. So I have no financial conflicts of interest. Sorry, I didn't do that. Nope. Okay, but I too have pictures. Okay, and as Joe indicated, we have had a very long-standing friendship since 1973. I think the picture here was a class trip ostensibly to the Science Center in Washington, or the Science Museum. I think we were supposed to be doing that on that trip. And the picture on the other side is from actually 1980 when Joe gave the toast to the bride at my wedding to that gentleman who was on the photograph. So I did start out at Dawson College and then moved on to McGill for my undergraduate and graduate degrees, following which I moved to Toronto and really haven't left Toronto since then. But I will tell you, I spent many, many, many hours sitting in this classroom listening to lectures when I was an undergrad here. It brings back memories. I won't necessarily say fond memories. Okay, so what is Ozempic? Okay, so we've heard that tune way too many times during the Olympics, on television all the time. And there's a lot of hype around Ozempic now, as many celebrities, so-called celebrities, wannabe celebrities, are all now advertising the miracles of Ozempic. And so my question today really is it a miracle drug? And where specifically did it come from? So I will say right now, I'm a PhD. I am not an MD. Okay, so what I'm going to speak about today really is more the basic science underlying the discovery of Ozempic. So technically, what is Ozempic? So first off, it's a synthetic molecule. And it's a synthetic molecule that looks a lot like glucagon-like peptide 1, which we'll call GLP-1. And it acts in the body in the same way that GLP-1 acts. And you can sort of see that from these 3D reconstructions of what in green, the structure of GLP-1 looks like, and the similarity of the structure of Ozempic, which is also known as semaglutide, and I'm just going to refer to it as Ozempic for the sake of simplicity. And both of these molecules bind to proteins in our body, the so-called GLP-1 receptor, to elicit biologic actions. So Ozempic is like GLP-1. What's GLP-1? Well, let's talk a little bit about that. So when I first started these studies in 1982, shortly after I arrived in Toronto, molecular biology had started to clone genes. And the gene for the pancreatic hormone, glucagon, was cloned. And everyone knew about glucagon. It's been known since pretty much almost the days of Banting and Best as an important hormone in our bodies. But the interesting part of this cloning exercise or discovery was that there were two other peptides inside this gene which looked a lot like glucagons, hence the name glucagon-like peptide, and they just named them 1 and 2 because we had no idea what they did. What we did know at that time is that they were made in the intestine. And so this is just a sort of schematic of what our intestinal epithelium looks like, and they're made in a cell, very specific cell type, which is called the L cell. And when these GLP-1 and GLP-2 are enzymatically cleaved out of this larger molecule, they are then transported into the bloodstream and released into our body. So they function as hormones. Now, this, in the intestines, this prohormone produces 3 biologically active hormones. It's actually quite remarkable how much comes out of this single protein. So one of these hormones is named oxyntomodulin. I'm not going to talk about it, but it, like GLP-1, is a satiety factor. It reduces your appetite. Another one is glucagon-like peptide 2, which stimulates gut growth. And today, we're going to speak about what is GLP-1. So remember, this was about 1982 when we first realized that these glucagon-like peptides existed. Okay. Sorry. So it wasn't until 1987 that we started to first get an idea of what GLP-1 actually did. And these were studies done by Daniel Drucker while he was a postdoc in Boston. And if I can predict and hope, Dan Drucker, who's a very close colleague of mine, may be one of Canada's next Nobel Prize winners for this discovery. So what was the discovery? Well, he took GLP-1 and he put it onto a tumor cell line from the rat. And this cell line was capable of producing insulin. And what he found, really for the first time, was that GLP-1 on these cells could stimulate insulin secretion. So you could see an increase after 1 hour, and sorry, most of my text has disappeared here, my labeling, I'm sorry. So the GLP-1 is red. So you see after 1 hour, it stimulates insulin secretion, and even after 24 hours, it stimulates insulin secretion. So there had been one other report in the literature that GLP-1 might have this biologic activity, but where Dan Drucker made the leap, and this is what attracted people's attention, was he suggested that it might possibly be of use in patients with what we then called non-insulin dependent diabetes mellitus. This is also then known as maturity onset diabetes, and we now refer to this as type 2 diabetes. So people with type 2 diabetes can produce insulin in their bodies, unlike type 1 diabetes. So type 2s do produce insulin, but they don't produce enough insulin for the body's needs. And so he suggested in these very early studies that it's possible that GLP-1 might actually help someone with type 2 diabetes produce more insulin. And that's really one of the, I think, the big breakthroughs in conceptually in this field. So almost immediately, things started to pick up. People's attention was raised. And so this is another study from just shortly thereafter in 1982 from Steve Bloom's lab, where they actually then infused it into humans. Because to do this in a tumor cell line doesn't really mean very much, right? Is it relevant to humans? And the answer is yes. So what they did is they infused these humans with a little bit of glucose, and then they infused them with either nothing, which was the saline, and you can see here the glucose stimulated a little bit of insulin secretion, or they infused them with GLP-1, and you can see this massive rise in insulin secretion with GLP-1 in humans. So this became now a clinically relevant topic of research, I think, proving that it worked in humans. Now, what was interesting at the time, and it wasn't really quite noticeable at the time, but you can see here the infusion actually started here. And there was no rise in insulin secretion until they started to infuse glucose. And this was the second really profound I think, discovery with GLP-1 is that it only stimulates insulin secretion when blood glucose levels are elevated. And so in contrast to some other diabetes drugs, which stimulate insulin secretion independent of your blood glucose, so your glucose could be high, but it could be low, which could cause hypoglycemia, GLP-1 is safe because it does not work when your blood sugar levels are down around normal, at least for insulin secretion. So this was pretty exciting, and at that point, pharmaceuticals started to come online, and in fact, other studies that were done, so just to give you an example here, showed that the effects of GLP-1 are actually profoundly glucose dependent. So these are studies that were done in a perfused rat pancreas. They just tied off the blood vessels and circulated glucose and circulated GLP-1 through the pancreas to look at insulin secretion. And you can see when blood glucose levels were low, this would count as hypoglycemia. The GLP-1 did absolutely nothing. But as soon as blood glucose levels started to get to the levels that you see after a meal, now you start to see in the black dots here a profound insulin secretion. And as glucose levels went up even higher, such as you might see in someone who has diabetes, the effects on insulin secretion are even better. So the effects are strictly glucose dependent, at least in terms of insulin secretion, making it a very safe drug. Okay, so what's the problem? Why didn't this go into the clinic immediately? All right, we're still talking 1980s here. Well, it turns out that GLP-1 doesn't survive very long in the circulation. And so in that first study that was done in humans, when they actually infused the GLP-1, they noticed that it disappeared almost immediately after they stopped the infusion. And studies that were done subsequently demonstrated that the half-life is only about 1 to 2 minutes in humans. So this is a drug that would either require continuous infusion, or there were going to have to be solutions found to prolong the half-life of drugs that were based on GLP-1. And that's really where the basic science in the pharmaceutical companies really started to play a very important role. But first, there was a very interesting discovery by a man named John Eng. And John was studying the venom of this bizarre lizard, the Gila monster, Heloderma suspectum, that lives in the sort of mountainous, dry, arid regions of Arizona. And the Gila lizard is incredibly toxic. You do not want to be bitten by one of these animals. But what he discovered in these animals was something that, again, completely changed the story in terms of GLP-1. So he discovered a molecule, a peptide, which is like GLP-1, glucagon-like peptide, that looked a lot like GLP-1. And now, so you can see here again, this is our model of GLP-1 bound to its receptor. And it turns out that exendin-4, as he so named it, looks incredibly like GLP-1. Okay? And then he tested the two peptides side by side in an experimental assay. And he found that as compared to nothing in this biological assay, GLP-1 and exendin-4 both were bioactive. Okay, so that might be completely independent of each other, right? Where John took the next step was, he said, what happens if I block the GLP-1 receptor? So you can see here, instead of this maximum biologic activity with GLP-1 here, when he blocked the GLP-1 receptor, the biologic action of GLP-1 disappeared. Well, that makes sense. But when he blocked the action of the GLP-1 receptor, the biologic activity of exendin-4 also disappeared. And so because of these studies done by John Eng, and you know, as we've later shown in terms of looking at the structures and the sequences of these molecules, is that exendin-4, for some very unknown reason, looks and acts like GLP-1, even though it's in the salivary gland of the Gila monster, the Gila lizard. We do not know why it's there. We literally have no idea why it's there. It's a very difficult animal to study. It's protected in the States. You can't really get hold of these animals, nor do you want to particularly, at least in my lab. Okay. But exendin-4, so it looks and acts like GLP-1, and it had another really unique characteristic which made it feasible for pharmacology. And that characteristic was that it had a much longer half-life. So remember, GLP-1 was 1 to 2 minutes. The half-life of exendin-4 is about 2.5 hours. So this means that it can be injected twice a day, and you can have biologic activity through the whole 24 hours of the day because it has a prolonged half-life. And this just shows some examples of studies where they injected it and then followed its disappearance over time. And the injections are just at different doses. And that led to the calculation then of what the half-life of this molecule was. So this was really incredibly exciting to the pharmaceutical companies. And in fact, in 2005, exendin-4, or a synthetic version of it, which was called exenatide or Byetta, was the first GLP-1-like molecule that was approved for the treatment of patients with type 2 diabetes. So it was really approved for its insulin-secreting, glucose-lowering abilities in these patients. And of course, the headlines, you know, lizard spit licks diabetes, were just, you know, irresistible. Okay, and just on this side, I've just shown you an example of what happens when people take this exenatide or Byetta twice a day. They do get a significant lowering in their hemoglobin A1C, which is a marker of your blood glucose levels. And they also had a modest but significant decrease in body weight. And for those of you who don't know, type 2 diabetes absolutely is associated with high blood sugar levels, but it is also associated often with overweight or obesity. So to be able to take a drug that lowers blood sugar levels but also causes you to lose weight was particularly exciting to people. Now, what do we know about the weight loss? So these are some studies that were done by a great student in my lab, and she actually just took mice. She fasted them overnight so that they would be hungry, and then she injected them with different doses of exendin-4, from low doses to high doses, and she measured how much food they ate. And what you can see is, even within 1 hour, the lowest dose of exendin-4 decreased food intake by about 50%. The high doses completely obliterated food intake in these animals. Okay, so it was very, very potent. And in fact, at some of the doses, food intake was still suppressed 24 hours later. Hence the weight loss that you observe with these drugs. So we wanted to know how it was doing that, because we know that if you give high doses of GLP-1 or Ozempic to naive patients, they will almost immediately start vomiting. Okay, so it does cause nausea and vomiting. And because mice don't vomit and you can't really ask them, we wanted to know why the mice weren't eating. So we measured gastric emptying in these mice, because we know that these drugs can slow down this function of the stomach. And, you know, at the doses that were effective in these mice, there was a little bit of gastric emptying, but not really very much, about 10%. Not enough to account for a 50% or more decrease in food intake. But when we did experiments to block neural signaling in these animals, so you can here see these are the control animals. So this is a control animal here injected with Extendin-4 to decrease food intake, right? And if we blocked the nervous system in these animals, we could prevent the effect on food intake. And we know from studies like this, as well as studies from knockout mice, for example, that don't have GLP-1 receptors in the brain, that most of the effects of Extendin-4 and other GLP-1 receptor agonists are mediated through signaling in the brain. Not entirely, but much of the body weight reduction is occurring at the level of your brain. So over the next few years, a number of GLP-1 receptor agonists were developed. So an example of this would be liraglutide, which was a slightly longer acting, injected once a day instead of twice a day. And then finally, the topic at hand, Ozempic, which is, semaglutide. Okay, you can see here. And this is the line for the disappearance of semaglutide over time. It has a half-life now of 46 hours, again, compared to 1 to 2 minutes for GLP-1. And that's why you can take this now once a week, because one injection will last you the entire week. And even from the very beginning, in terms of the clinical trials with Ozempic, it turned out to be particularly effective. So this shows us, compared to nothing, right, that Ozempic lowers blood sugar levels profoundly, as measured by that hemoglobin A1C indicator, and it also has a decent effect to reduce body weight at the same time. Now, we use higher doses than this now, so the effects on glucose and the effects on body weight are even greater than we saw in those early trials, right? But this really, I think, set the stage now for once-weekly injections of Ozempic, and really changed the world as we know it. So we've been using GLP-1 receptor agonists like Extendin-4 for 19 years in the clinic now for the treatment of type 2 diabetes, and 10 years now for the treatment of obesity. Okay, and I'll come back to that thought in a minute. Okay, so the good news about GLP-1 is that that receptor that causes the actions of GLP-1 is widely expressed. And so lots of different studies, in biological studies, where they would, for example, take the receptor, this is a 3D model of the receptor, hooked it up to a fluorescent probe and said, what parts of the body fluoresce? Where is the receptor expressed? Molecular biology techniques used to detect the mRNA transcripts for the receptor. And through studies like that, we now know that the GLP-1 receptor, through which Ozempic acts, is expressed in a wide variety of different tissues in the body. You know, and you can see here, like the pancreas, where you get the insulin secretion, but it's also, for example, in blood vessels in the kidney, it's in very scattered cells in the heart, it's in the stomach, as we know. And so this actually means that there are a wide variety of biological actions of these drugs because the receptor is present in so many places in the body. Okay, so on the good side of it, of course, is we know there are receptors in the pancreas, and we have this glucose-dependent insulin release, which is hugely important in type 2 diabetes. We now know, particularly at the higher doses, that we get significant weight loss because it suppresses appetite. There is an effect on gastric emptying, and slowing down how fast your stomach empties can help delay rises in blood glucose levels. So this is a nice anti-diabetic effect. But in many clinical trials now, there are receptors in the cardiovascular system, and we now know that GLP-1 receptor agonists, such as Ozempic, are actually cardioprotective. They reduce cardiovascular events, they reduce strokes, they, in fact, can reduce all-cause mortality in patients with obesity or heart failure, even in the absence of diabetes. And in the United Kingdom, these drugs have now been approved for cardiologists to use in their patients as a treatment of cardiovascular disease. So that may be coming down the line for us in some time in the future. And all of these studies were based, I will say, on studies that were originally done in research models, which have now been proven to be true in humans. Reduced decline in kidney function and also of death due to end-stage renal disease in patients taking these drugs with type 2 diabetes, at least. That's the very first trial that came out. So now indications for the treatment of kidney disease. Reduced fat in the liver and reduced fibrosis, so suggesting that it may play a role in metabolic-associated liver disease, for example. And because it acts in the brain, there have been lots of suggestions that it may be useful in Parkinson's and Alzheimer's and perhaps in some addictive behaviors. Much of this still remains to be proven in clinical trials. But right now, there are about 500 clinical trials ongoing to see if some of these claims, as we heard from Dr. Joe, are in fact borne out by the evidence. Okay, so that's great. So what's the downside? Well, the downside is because it's expressed in all these places, there are also adverse effects. And just in my last couple of slides, so I'll show you some adverse effects that people talk about it. So the red text here are things that are actually known as an adverse event. And you can see that we talked about the nausea and the vomiting. These drugs require careful titration. You can't just start taking the highest dose. People have ended up in the hospital with such severe vomiting that they can't stop because they wanted to take it all at once, or they wanted to take 2 injections to lose more weight. It doesn't work that way. You have to take it very carefully with your physician. It can cause delays, significant delays in gastric emptying in some patients. It's been suggested to be problematic in situations where you're getting, for example, a colonoscopy and you have to fast, but your stomach is still full. We don't really know whether that's quite correct yet. The gallbladder emptying is a problem. You have to be careful if you have gallbladder disease not to take these drugs because it can lead to or contribute to gallstones. The other effects, I would say you see here in blue and in yellow, not proven, okay, through good clinical trials. And so they remain, I would say, let's remain on the fence and see whether these prove to be true. These drugs are expensive. Not everyone can afford them. They're peptides. They're complicated molecules to make. We've also used these drugs in type 2 diabetes for 19 years, but we've only used it for 10 years in obesity, and not at all for any of these other indications. And so long-term safety data is still required. We're using higher doses, we're using new drugs, so it really remains to be clinically proven that these drugs continue to be safe in all of these different indications and doses, and in fact the different drugs. And there's very limited data now about whether they're safe to use in teens as well as in pregnant women. And so again, we need ongoing clinical trials to actually prove that it's true. So my penultimate slide, I have to put this in. This is the audience for this. There's a lot of hype out there. And so, you know, people are trying to make money. So Ozempic that's ordered online may not necessarily contain Ozempic or may not contain GLP-1. As you've seen, there have been reports of people getting vials of insulin and ending up in the hospital with hypoglycemia when they thought that they were taking Ozempic. Because insulin is cheap and Ozempic is not. You put it in a pen and someone takes it, right? That's their problem. They're not always pharmaceutical grade, so they can be contaminated with bacteria. They can be contaminated with, let's just call them noxious substances, and can cause allergic reactions at the very least. So you do need to be careful that you actually are getting the real thing. From a reliable source. Novo would say that they're the only reliable source, so you've got to keep that in mind. The scammers, so there have been suggestions, this is from an article in the New York Times, that just because you're not eating as much, you're going to be vitamin deprived, vitamin deficient, and I would argue back that just because you're dieting doesn't mean you don't have to eat well. And you don't need to be vitamin deficient if you're eating properly, even if you're eating less. And then, sorry, this is a very reactive pointer. And then finally, I had to put this one up. I just love this Ozempic, faux Zempic, etc. So GLP-1 is made by your intestines. It's released in response to a meal. So of course, if you eat something that could potentially release GLP-1, then it must be good for you, right? Well, if eating oatmeal could prevent the obesity epidemic that we have in the world right now, then we wouldn't have an obesity epidemic. It's clearly nonsense. So remember, if you get GLP-1 released, so you eat oatmeal, sure, you get some GLP-1, it's gone in 2 minutes, right? This is not what we're doing with the pharmaceuticals, I will say. So you have to be an informed consumer, I would say, to take these drugs. They're very powerful, and there's a lot going out there right now in terms of the hype, which brings out people that you may not want to be purchasing products from. Okay, so I'm going to stop here. It's an incredible bench-to-bedside story through, scientists with ideas, cells, lots of different animal models, humans, to get us to Ozempic and all the related molecules that are out there now. Is it a miracle drug? I think it depends on who you ask. It is certainly an amazing story, and I think the story is not over yet. So just hold on to your seat, because there may be more coming down the road. So, thank you. I'm not going to show the last slide, so you can just get rid of it.
Always good to hear it from the horse's mouth, right? Now we know the real story of Ozempic. Okay, let me just get to our next speaker. Let me introduce Dr. Pieter Cohen, who's an MD at Harvard. He actually sees patients. And he has done an amazing amount of work on dietary supplements. I can tell you in the US, when there's some news story about dietary supplements, something has come out, the next miracle, which happens daily. There'll be an article about it in USA Today or the New York Times, and the first comment is always from Pieter Cohen, because he's now recognized as the expert in dietary supplements. And as with Ozempic, dietary supplements are an amazing story, because they play a role in so many people's lives. There are some pluses, and there are negatives. Pieter is going to enlighten us. Now, he's from the US, so the work that he does is in the US. And the regulations in the US are somewhat different from ours here. We have a natural product directorate here, which actually requires a modicum of evidence. Trivial amount of evidence required, but at least it is something. In the US, the story is a little bit different. You can sell a dietary supplement until the FDA tells you not to sell it. So we're going to hear about dietary supplements, what they can and cannot do, and why we need to look at these with a skeptical eye. So let's welcome Dr. Pieter Cohen.
So it's a real honor to be here tonight, to join you up here. And it is true that we're going to be talking about the US, but there is a lot of overlap between the two. And what I'd like to do is take you through, just imagine tonight that you're trying to pick up some dietary supplements, which here are natural health products. That's just our name. So I'm going to use dietary supplement or supplement for that. Apologize if that's a little confusing. Imagine you're in New York, you're in Boston, and you're trying to pick up some vitamins, minerals, botanicals, protein powder on store shelves. Okay, so just get yourself mentally ready. That's what you're about to try to do. First, I do have some disclosures. So I've done research with a bunch of companies that do high quality supplement testing. I've been sued for $100 million by a supplement company. That jury trial wasn't fun, but fortunately the jury found in my favor, so my wife still allows me to continue doing this research. And other than that, I recommend supplements to my patients all the time. So every day in clinic, recommending that my patients take their vitamins, their minerals, their iron to treat the conditions that they have. So I'm a big fan. So basically, I'm going to take us through what's permitted to be placed on the labels. Like, why is it that there are these GLP-1 supplements out there? Why is that legal in the United States? And we'll explore how the content of dietary supplements in the United States compares to the label. We'll think about how the safety of that, the effect of that, does that actually have safety implications for consumers? And finally, how to go about choosing that dietary supplement that is going to work for the reason you'd like it to. But before I get started, I just wanted to briefly tell you how I got interested in this. I take care of patients. I'm a primary care doc outside of Boston. And early on, one of my patients who was a municipal truck driver came to me distraught. And he was distraught because he had just been told that on a urine test for his work, he had tested positive for amphetamine. Because of that, he was no longer allowed to drive. That came as a complete shock to him because he wasn't using amphetamines. What he told me was that he was using a weight loss supplement that his wife had asked him to start taking. And he thought it might be the culprit. So we sent that to the lab. And when the lab came back with a remarkable finding, which was that it didn't contain amphetamine, but it contained a prescription drug that I never heard of called fenproprax. This is a prescription drug that's only prescribed in Brazil and several other countries, never approved for use in the United States. And that really opened my mind to the complexity of the chemistry, the biology, and pharmacology of what might be going on in weight loss products our patients in the United States are taking. We did some research, take a look at how frequently people were taking these pills and the harms they were causing. And when we were in the process of communicating that in the local community, the FDA reached out to me. They said, Peter, what you found in your patients, what you're seeing is something that we're worried about throughout the nation. It's that we're seeing weight loss supplements that are spiked with pharmaceutical drugs, sometimes multiple pharmaceutical drugs in the same product. So that interested me a bit over 15 years ago into this question that we'll talk about tonight. But first off, I just want to explain how dietary supplements defined in the United States. It's really a large gathering of products. The laws were originally created and would work pretty well if we were just talking about vitamins and minerals. But as the law was being formed, this is in the 1980s and early 1990s, many other products were lumped in with vitamins. Botanicals, all manner of botanicals, amino acids, protein powders, glandular extracts, live microorganisms, which are sometimes called probiotics. And all of this is sold as dietary supplements. If, again, when you're in Boston and you're looking at store shelves, it's often hard to tell what's a supplement. Here's the key, and that is that if it's a supplement, it'll have a supplement facts label, and if it's an over-the-counter medication, like for us, something like ibuprofen or acetaminophen, it'll be a drug facts label. And if it's something that's being sold as a food, and oftentimes these categories are hard to distinguish, it's called nutrition facts. So what about the advertising claims? So I'm going to talk about memory, because Joe very nicely showed us some examples of along weight loss and GLP-1. So here's an example of a memory optimizer. So what's going on here? Well, let's take a look at what's listed on the label. What's listed on the label is 3 ingredients. And as far as I could find, neither the first 2 ingredients, vitamin B5 or this form of choline, have ever been shown in an animal study or in a human study to improve memory. Now, the third ingredient is very interesting because it is found in trace amounts in plants. It's also been developed as a pharmaceutical drug for Alzheimer's disease. What's interesting, too, is that it has been studied in humans who don't have Alzheimer's disease to see if it will help with memory. And we actually know that it doesn't. It doesn't work. So we have two ingredients that have never been studied in animals or humans for memory, and 1 ingredient that has been shown not to work. But if you're selling supplements in the United States, don't worry, because you're still good. As long as your label sticks to what we call structure function claims, you can position your supplement as having that benefit in humans. Here I list some other examples. And just like Joe told us earlier, there's no need that you have a clinical trial in humans or even a clinical trial in animals to demonstrate that works that way. There are some things you can't say. You can't say that something prevents or cures a disease. So if you said on the supplement label, this can prevent Alzheimer's, you're going to run into problems with the FDA and the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, which oversees advertising as well as the FDA. So where do you get accurate information? You can get accurate information, at least in the States, and I'm sure there's equivalent in Canada. The National Institute of Health has an Office of Dietary Supplements. Their website, which of course is publicly available, has excellent evidence-based summaries of all manner of dietary supplements, all sorts of different botanical ingredients and the like. So I recommend you go there, find the information you're looking for, then go back to find them on store shelves. Now, there's a little bit of a problem, though, when it comes to that last step, which is finding what you're looking for on store shelves. And let me explain to you what we're running into here in the south of the border. So basically, we have a few problems. See them here. And I'm going to talk you through these problems in 1 sec. So we have manufacturing requirements. They're called current good manufacturing requirements. There's some basic principles that companies need to prepare their dietary supplements in a sterile environment, that they need to confirm when they buy bulk something from another country, for example, that it is the ingredient they purchased. And they need to keep records of what they did in the manufacturing steps. But there are a few things that our current good manufacturing practices doesn't include. And this can lead to some problems in a disconnect between what's listed on the label and what's in the bottle. So one thing is that the amount of the ingredient isn't listed, the correct part of the plant, traditional prep. So I'm going to go over these each one at a time. So there's something called a proprietary blend. And the idea here is that if a company would prefer not to tell what's in their secret sauce to other competitors, they can put the ingredient in something called a proprietary blend. And as soon as they do that, they don't need to tell you how much of that ingredient's in it. So even if something's active, like caffeine, they don't have to tell you how much caffeine is in it in a product. And so we did a study looking at a number of different brands of dietary supplements where caffeine was listed as part of a proprietary blend. What we found is that there were significant amounts of caffeine, the equivalent of 2 to 3 small cups of coffee, or a very large 2 or 3 espressos in supplements that listed caffeine but buried in the middle of a proprietary blend. Now, another problem is that the current good manufacturing practices in the United States don't require that the right part of the plant is used. So if we were to, let's imagine we're running an Italian restaurant and we're using our garlic to cook our pasta sauce. What a great thing to do would be to sell the husks as garlic dietary supplements. And you're 100% this is completely on board and not violating the law, as long as in very small type in the back of your supplement where it says garlic, you put in parentheses husks. You're good to go. So sometimes you might not be getting exactly what you expect. Similarly, preparation. So in many botanical ingredients that people will use to be beneficial to their health, there's going to be compounds in there that are either identical to or similar to pharmaceutical drugs. And it really is all about how you prepare that botanical. So here's a situation of mucuna beans. Mucuna beans actually have a drug in them called levodopa, which is used to treat Parkinson's disease. There's a small amount of levodopa in mucuna beans, and mucuna beans have been used traditionally for a variety of natural remedies. When mucuna beans are traditionally prepared, there's a small amount of levodopa in them. So what we did was we compared how much levodopa was in the actual beans when traditionally extracted, compared to the amount of levodopa found in dietary supplements we were purchasing in store shelves in the United States. And what we found that, as you can see here, there was a bit of a discrepancy at times between how much you'd expect from the beans and how much we were seeing in supplements. You can also, that's one way you can get too much of an ingredient. Another way you can get too much of an ingredient is, another aspect of the law, is that it doesn't specify the upper limit. So in other words, if you put melatonin in and you write on the label 5 milligrams, all you need to do is at the end of the shelf life of the supplement, you're supposed to have at least 5 milligrams of melatonin in the product. Now, if you make a product that's not very stable and the melatonin starts degrading fast, what you can state, or the business plan could be, is let's just throw a ton of melatonin in here to start, and then 12 months later, maybe there'll be more than 5 milligrams. Again, it's completely on the up and up. Well, that might explain a bit of what we found when we studied melatonin products and found that there were sometimes almost 350% of the melatonin listed on the label in the actual products. Time doesn't permit me to tell you, but you can just imagine applying these principles to live bacteria. Well, but that's for another night. Now, remember, obviously, the good manufacturing practices are small, is a low bar. But even that low bar is not regularly accomplished or jumped over by many manufacturers. And here's an example of recent FDA inspections of firms and whether or not they passed inspection. Basically, they were doing the current good manufacturing practices without getting a really strong letter from the FDA. And you can see that there's a bit of a disconnect between the law and following the law. So we've talked about a lot of things, but if the company is not following good manufacturing practices, we have even more problems. Number one is quantity. So galantamine, that drug that we talked about earlier, is sold both as a prescription medication and as a dietary supplement. That allowed us to publish a study last year in JAMA in which we compared how accurate is the label when something's sold as a dietary supplement compared to a prescription drug. What we found is the prescription galantamine, accurately labeled, the supplement, not so much so. Contamination we looked at. So this was contamination, again, back to good manufacturing practices. It needs to be a sterile environment. What we saw was all the prescription galantamine, no bacterial contamination, almost a third of the dietary supplement galantamine contaminated with bacteria. The other problem is what we call economic adulteration, or a situation where the company finds that the botanical or the herb or the item that they're selling gets expensive. And there needs to do a little workaround if you want to save some money. And sometimes some of these workarounds, and turmeric is a good example because there's often there has been many cases of adulteration, is that sometimes we find synthetic versions of the drug, dyes, chalk, or starch in those products. We've also found that sometimes a bottle might list botanical on the label, but actually contain novel drugs inside. So that was the case. We bought some Craze workout supplements from GNC and ran it through the lab. And what we found was a brand new analog of methamphetamine. So that wasn't really that great, but we looked on labels to say, oh, well, how is that being advertised? And they were promoting it as an extract of this rare orchid, Dendrobium. So can these cause health issues? I think for time reasons, I'm going to skip these slides. You guys can ask about them afterwards to their interest. Because I want to jump to the question, because I think it's probably quite self-evident that we could run some problems here, and we do. I'll just summarize that way. So let's move to my last major point, which is how can a consumer in the US, or if you're buying online from the US, select an effective, accurately labeled, safe supplement from the United States. So here's my tips. So first off, we've talked about the National Institute of Health's, as you choose a supplement that you want to use based on the evidence. Next thing is look for a supplement that just lists that ingredient on the label. So the mixtures of botanicals rarely have been studied. If you want to take black cohosh, purchase the black cohosh supplement. Next thing is avoid supplements that have these structure-function claims, because as we discussed, there's not much in the way of stopping manufacturers from saying the supplements will work for whatever reason they would like to sell them for. Therefore, and it creates incentive for some of that adulteration that we talked about earlier. The final thing is that there is, I'll show you in the next slide a bit about third-party certification, and then also ideally talk to your clinician. Hopefully they're open-minded and willing to engage you in a conversation about it that's supportive to find safe supplements. In terms of high-quality dietary supplements, one thing you can rely on in the United States is high-quality third-party certification processes. Unfortunately, almost every supplement bottle you'll have is stamped with a lot of things, and it'll appear as if it's third-party certification. So you really have to learn what these names are of the highest quality ones. So USP, the US Pharmacopoeia, has an excellent program. NSF International, which I do research with, and then these other programs are really high quality. So if it has one of these stamps on the label, I know that it has what's on the label is the ingredients that's in the bottle. So just to review, here are my take-home points. The law permits health claims, even if they're not proven, or even if there's not a single study in humans. It does not require that botanical supplements be labeled in such a way that we can know what part of the, how much of an active ingredient is in it. And sometimes it's confusing even what part of the plant is involved. There's also a problem with US manufacturers following the basic principles of these basic principles, the low bar that's set by the FDA. And, which we didn't have time, this is another area of a lot of research that we do, is looking at what happens when the FDA finds a supplement adulterated with one of these pharmaceuticals or a new drug. What I'll just summarize is that they basically can't get it off the market or don't have the political will to do so. So basically, they remain on store shelves. And these can have health problems. You'll have to trust me on that. tonight, and, but there's a workaround. Independent research, choosing only single ingredient supplements, and using high quality third-party certification programs. So thank you for your time. Sorry it's run so late, but I really appreciate it. It's an honor to be here.
Okay, we're going to have a few minutes for questions, and I think I'll use my prerogative to start it off. As Pieter, I mean, you talked about vitamins and minerals, which are legitimate for some people. What else have you found to be legitimate?
Yeah, so when I say I recommend supplements to my patients regularly, it's basically vitamins and minerals for usually deficiencies of those vitamins and minerals, and sometimes to prevent deficiencies. So in situations where someone has problems absorbing nutrients from their intestines, it's a good idea to take a multivitamin or to take other vitamins to prevent it. But for the most part, my recommendation, there's only a few indications where completely healthy people without any medical issues need to take supplements. It is a vitamin, though. Two examples of those are folic acid in young or women of childbearing age, and calcium for older people. So those would be the two examples I would point to where you might want to take a vitamin or a mineral without talking to your doctor first.
What about some botanical?
Well, I can't say that I'm regularly recommending any botanicals to my patients for medical conditions.
Have you ever recommended a botanical?
Well, I would say I've sometimes recommended, the next thing that in the past actually I used to recommend would be omega-3, which is not a botanical, but there's a lot of very interesting research about omega-3. The thing is, the totality of the situation right now is I think there's only a very narrow window of clinical utility for omega-3. I think it's pretty much because the research was done prior to the current evidence base. So now with the excellent cardiovascular medications we have, I don't see a big benefit of omega-3 improving on that.
You know, when I said at the beginning that if you're going to market a supplement, you look through the literature to find some natural product that you can then blow up out of proportion. Well, if you can find some plant or flower or bean that nobody has ever heard of, that's even better, right?
But Joe, I do want to follow up on that, your question about me prescribing botanicals. I don't want anyone to take that the wrong way. I don't discourage my patients from taking botanicals if they choose to, if they've done the research, they think it's right for themselves, and they're choosing a safe product. So there are things that I might be, checking in every visit. Are you taking this? Vitamins and minerals. And there are other things that I think it's totally appropriate for patients to make their own decisions.
Pat, you talked about fake Ozempic and all of that, but there's another issue there is these compounding pharmacists who say that they can make Ozempic comparable, right, for much, much less money. Because Ozempic is, in what is it now in the US, $1,200 something a month, right? In Canada, it's less, what, $300? So it's a lot of money. So obviously, there's motivation to make cheaper versions. So the compounding pharmacists claim they can do that.
Yeah, I honestly, sorry, this sounds a little loud. Turn it up. Okay, so I honestly have to say, knowing how complicated it is to create a biosynthetic peptide, where you have to add chemical reactions, amino acid after amino acid after amino acid, and in some cases you attach, for example, a fatty acid chain as a linker. I would find it unlikely to. I would be skeptical about compounding pharmacy to be able to do this unless they have huge resources behind them in terms of synthetic chemistry.
Okay, traditionally, as far as the audience goes, we ask Lauren to ask the first question. Lauren.
Yes, you've mentioned that Ozempic is quite expensive. I've heard that there's quite a few other molecules that are either on the market or coming that have a similar mode of action. I'm just wondering, as more and more of these molecules show up, do you think that the supply and demand might alter the cost dynamics of this and bring the cost of these things down with more competition?
Right, yeah, it's a great question. So my understanding is, as Joe said, was it's about $300 or so a month in Canada, at least, which is expensive for many people. And so there are a very large number of other compounds that are being studied, compounds with even more complex compositions, in fact, where they're starting to mix 2 different peptides together in a single molecule, or 3 different peptides together in a single molecule to exploit the effects of all 3 of those different hormones. And so I think the creation of those molecules, first off, is challenging, expensive. Some of it's done by basic scientists in the lab, some of it's done by pharmaceutical companies. And so peptides are, I would believe, not going to be cheap anytime in the near future. Insulin is now, at least in Canada, quite cheap. Maybe in a few places in the States, the price is being capped. But it's used by many, many, many people worldwide, and the price of insulin has come down over time. The other thing that I do know is that Novo Nordisk, who makes Ozempic and the Wegovy, which is the same molecule at a higher dose, is building factories around the world right now, trying to keep up with demand. And so that's going to add to the cost, or contribute to the cost, because they have to build all these new factories. So I think the peptides are going to be expensive for a while. There are clinical trials going on to try to find small molecules that could replace the peptides. And there are a few that seem to be able to work. So those might be cheaper than the peptides. So, you know, the bottom line is I think they're going to be expensive for a while, unfortunately.
Okay, anyone else? Okay, who's got the mic? Okay, here?
So what I'm going to ask about is Ozempic being prescribed as a prescription drug for a specific type of illness, type 2 diabetes, and how it became the drug of the month for people who just want to lose weight. And wouldn't it be dangerous to take it if you don't have that condition? And then if you stop taking it, like I assume if you're diabetic, it's something that you have to take regularly. But if you want, and you're losing weight, if you stop taking it, it's an appetite suppressant? Is that what's happening? And you just put weight on again? So my main concern is, isn't it dangerous if you don't have a particular disease for which it was designed for, or conditions? So
absolutely, I would agree. You shouldn't be taking prescription drugs for something that it's not indicated for. Right, unquestionably. You know, we've been using these drugs for 19 years in patients with type 2 diabetes. So I think in general, we consider them to be quite safe. And those individuals do also happen to lose weight. But once the weight loss started to be explored more, massive clinical trials were done on people with obesity who did not have type 2 diabetes. And the clinical trials so far have indicated that they are, in fact, safe to take. Similarly, the studies on cardiovascular safety, done in people with type 2 diabetes, done in people with overweight or obesity, but also done in people without either of those indications. And so again, the studies are pretty much across the board confirmatory that these drugs are cardioprotective, and that's why we're now starting to see them prescribed in patients who do not have type 2 diabetes or overweight obesity. Right? But the clinical trials have to be done to prove they're safe for each indication. Right? And taking these, they're powerful drugs. You don't want to take them as a joke. You don't want to take them for a week to lose weight to get into your bikini, is in my opinion, or your Hollywood Oscar dress. And finally, I will say that most of the data would suggest that you will, if you stop taking your blood pressure medication, your blood pressure will go back up. So these are appetite suppressants. If you stop taking them, your appetite will come back. There is some data that suggests that one of the newer drugs, Mounjaro, also called tirzepatide, that not everyone who goes off it regains all the weight back. But it's still fairly limited data. So once you're on them, the general thought right now is you're probably going to be on them for a long time.
Okay, let's go to the back there.
How about a couple of months ago, I think we saw some JAMA publications saying that Ozempic could also reduce cancer or fight cancer. How do we deal with claims like that with a drug that already has so much hype, and on top of that you add the cancer claim?
Right. So the first thing I'll say is that I think this was a colon cancer study, and colon cancer is associated with obesity. So losing weight in of itself might confer some protection. The second thing I would say is, as we've been speaking about, make sure you find the right studies. Was this done in 16 people? Was this done, in 100,000 people, right? So you have to look at the trials and make sure the trials are appropriately set up. They have a control group, they have a test group, they have sufficient numbers of individuals to actually determine whether or not there is a real effect. And the problem is that the rarer the event, the more people you need in a clinical trial to decide whether it's true or not. So if something only happens to 1 in 100,000 people, you would need hundreds of millions of people to find out if there's a difference between your control group and your drug group, right? So I think you need to think about all of those things when you're looking at reports. Was this a true clinical trial? Was it just an observation, for example, in a limited number of patients? That's where I would start, certainly.
Peter, one of the arguments that dietary supplement manufacturers use is that Big Pharma is trying to sweep them under the carpet because they want to keep selling their expensive, ineffective drugs. Whereas the fact is that very often Big Pharma also sells exactly the same stuff, right? So what do you say to these people, who have this complaint that Big Pharma doesn't want supplements sold because they can't be patented? That's another argument.
Yes. I think that it's really important to try to avoid and step back from this duality. Like you're either a supplement supporter or you're a pharmaceutical supporter, as if it's two political parties. And it would be best just to take a step back and look and ask the question, is there evidence and does it work? And you can choose from both of them and you can combine them, but make wise choices in both categories. Pharmaceutical drugs can cause all sorts of problems, of course, not used wisely, and even when used wisely. And so yes, and be transparent with your clinician about what you're taking.
Okay, let's go here. Down here.
Hi, I was wondering if we could compare Ozempic with metformin.
Yes, they're both drugs that are used in patients with type 2 diabetes. They have completely different types of activities. And so, you know, the Ozempic drugs work through the GLP-1 receptor. We talked about metformin. It actually has a lot of different biologic activities, and it's been a little bit difficult to sort out why it works. But one of the things that it seems to do is to prevent your liver from producing too much glucose. And so they're really just completely different approaches to the treatment of type 2 diabetes. And in fact, a lot of physicians, and the physician in the room can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but you know, so the initial sort of, in Canada, the first line treatment for type 2 diabetes, unless your blood sugar levels are, you know, sort of through the roof, is that you take, you know, diet, exercise, and metformin, and see if you can control your glucose with it. It's cheap, it's orally available, it's easy to take, and if, you know, for a lot of people, especially in the beginning stages of type 2 diabetes, this drug works pretty well. If it doesn't work, then amongst your second choices that you could take, now that's where the GLP-1 receptor agonists come in, such as Ozempic. But they are just, they work in completely different ways.
Okay, I've also heard it's good as a supplement for people who are not even diabetic. Perhaps Dr. Cohen knows Dr. David Sinclair, who recommends metformin for people who are not diabetic.
There are some indications, like we use metformin to treat polycystic ovarian syndrome. And some people would use metformin for a condition called prediabetes, but in general, it's not very effective in terms of weight loss. And aside from those smaller indications, metformin is mainly used to treat diabetes.
There's a lot of hypo at metformin and all the alternative literature as an anti-aging drug.
I'll just say, Joe, that that's not what I prescribe it for my patients, and nor do I take it myself.
So that's not how you kept from aging.
No. But you can see from my photo that maybe I should have been taking metformin.
Okay, we have another one here.
For Dr. Brubaker, there's been some literature lately about how semaglutide and similar drugs are possibly useful in combating inflammation in general. How far along with that are we, and could that be the reason it's cardioprotective?
Yeah, that's a great question. Absolutely. These drugs do seem to reduce inflammation. It's certainly suspected as one possible way that it could be cardioprotective. There are very few receptors in the heart. And so it's a little bit, it's profound effects on the cardiovascular system may be due in part to decreased inflammation. There are no GLP-1 receptors in the liver, almost none. And so decreased inflammation may be one of the ways that it helps reduce liver fibrosis, amongst other things. So yeah, unquestionably, and certainly in animal models, you can see clear anti-inflammatory effects. The immune system doesn't have very many GLP-1 receptors in it. And so some immune cells in the gut do, quite clearly. So whether this is all mediated through gut effects, we don't really know. But it's certainly something that people are very interested in looking at.
Thank you. Okay, we'll take one more, and since we haven't taken anyone from this group here, right there.
Okay, hello. Oh, that's loud. My question is for Dr. Cohen. One of your slides, you mentioned 30% of US facilities didn't follow GMPs, good manufacturing practices. Do you know what the consequences to that? Is it like a slap? Is it a report? Is it they follow up 6 months later? Like, what are the steps that are taken afterwards is more of my question.
Yeah, that's a super question, the kind of question we would develop a study to look at. What I can just say, because we haven't thoroughly studied it, is that what we generally see is that the FDA sends a letter that clearly outlining all the violations to the company and says you need to get back to us in a certain amount of time to sort those out. And then the FDA will do a higher priority to return to those companies. And when they return, they, if they find the same violations, they go back and write the same letter, send it back to the company, and it's kind of like a cycle. Yeah. So that's what we've seen. I think that it's a great question, and it should be more methodically studied, so it's not just my sense of what's going on.
It's always a bit sad when these events come to an end, because you put so much effort into it. But there's always sort of a little thing at the end that is still very enjoyable, and that is a little gift that we make up for Lauren every year with the poster on it, and he tells me that he still has place on his mantle, right, for one more. Yeah, Lauren reminds me, he did send me a picture to show that there's space still for another one. But can you trust the picture these days? So there are some other thanks. Certainly our administration has been wonderful in supporting us in every way. And for those of you who have been with us here, and I know many of you have been with us here for many symposiums, you know that the machinery behind it included Emily Shore, who organized everything. But she's on maternity leave, unapproved, but she's on maternity leave, but we've had tremendous help to take her place, although she basically prepared everything. But it took 3 to replace her. So here are 3 wonderful assistants, headed by Kat, who really did a wonderful job putting it together, because I can tell you there's a lot that happens behind the scenes, before you get to an event like this. Just like, when you go to a concert or you go to some performance, you don't really think of, everything that goes into it. But it takes a lot of preparation, it takes a lot of effort. So thank you very much for your support and for coming here, and hopefully you're going home more educated than you were about Ozempic and about dietary supplements. And hopefully we will see you next year. Incidentally, I can, believe it or not, I can give you a preview of next year, because we do have our speaker lined up, which is Nobel Prize winner Drew Weissman, who received the Nobel Prize last year for development of the COVID vaccine. So that's going to be some event. We'll see you then.